Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm Barb Wyndham, and I'm so glad that you're all joining us this evening for Beth Am's webinar on the California Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. I'd like to thank Beth Am's JIAC, which is the Jewish and Israel Advocacy Committee, for hosting this event. JIAC works to counter anti-Semitism and BDS and promote a secure Israel by educating and mobilizing our community. If you'd like to stay informed, wait, hold on, I can do this. If you'd like to stay informed, you can be added to Beth Am JIAC's email list. Please send an email to this address, bethamjiac@gmail.com. And just put add me to the list in the subject line, and they will make sure that you get put on the list. And you don't have to worry, they will not overload your inbox. They basically only send action alerts when they're needed. So in addition to Beth Am JIAC, I'd also like to thank our Zoom hosts this evening who are helping this program to function really smoothly. Thank you so much to Joanne Donsky, who has really been the driving force behind this program. Thank you so much, Joanne. And her team includes Jeff Carmel, Sandy Hirsch, and Rita Allen. Thanks to all of you for all that you're doing to make this work. Before introducing our speakers, there are a few housekeeping items. You are all automatically muted, and we hope you will stay on mute so that everyone can hear the speakers without any distraction. And as I was mentioning earlier, we encourage you to switch to speaker view so that you can get the most from this webinar. Also, the chat function should be turned off now, and it will stay off through the presentation. Chat will be available again after the presentation so that you can ask questions during the Q&A. Now, if you have questions that you want to submit prior to the chat opening, you can do that. And the way to do that, if you have questions, the way to do that is you can email your questions to bethamjiac@gmail.com. We will be checking there and adding your questions to the list. Just so you know, a number of questions have already been submitted in advance, and we will try to answer them and as many of the others as time allows. So feel free to, yes, send them to bethamjiac@gmail.com, or when the chat opens after the presentation, you can feel free to enter your questions into the chat. And now to our speakers. We have two great speakers tonight. The first is Alina Kaplan. She's the co-founder of the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, a diverse coalition. It's a grassroots coalition working to ensure that K-12 ethnic studies inspires mutual respect, anti-racism, and balanced analysis while fighting political proselytizing in the classroom. Alina has managed nonprofit organizations for over 12 years. Most recently, she ran the Social Services Division of Mid-Penn Housing, which is one of California's largest affordable housing nonprofits. Prior to that, she served as the Chief Program Officer at the Oshman Family JCC, overseeing all programming, including early childhood education, youth, and teens. Alina has also worked in the high-tech industry. She holds an MBA from Stanford and a BS degree in mathematics and computer science from Duke. Dr. Michael Harris, our other speaker, was one of the founders of the San Francisco Voice for Israel and now serves as a lay leader with Stand With Us in the Bay Area. For those of you unfamiliar with it, Stand With Us is a nonpartisan organization that inspires and educates people of all ages and backgrounds about Israel, challenging misinformation and fighting anti-Semitism. Mike has spoken about Israel at synagogues, churches, political groups, and senior centers, as well as standing up for Israel against anti-Israel demonstrators on the streets of the Bay Area. He has appeared on radio and television news reports as a local spokesperson, for Stand With Us, and for San Francisco Voice for Israel. In his spare time, which I don't know how he has any at all, he's also a pediatrician in Marin County. His book, Winning a Debate with an Israel Hater, was first published in October 2015, and a second edition came out in November 2018. I highly recommend it. We're thrilled to have both Alina and Mike with us tonight, so I'll turn it over to them.
Great, thank you, Barb, and welcome everybody. Very excited to be with you. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully people can see it. Somebody nod your heads if you can see the screen.
Yep, we got it.
Nodding heads. Okay, good.
We can see the screen, but you need to put it in, we can see the screen, but you should put it into slideshow view.
Yes, thank you. Let's get that going. Okay, there we go. So here's how we're going to do this. Mike and I are going to tag team a bit. I will do the first part and talk to you about, do some context setting about what ethnic studies is. And Mike will then take over from there and talk us through some of the details of what has happened in the California ethnic studies process. And we'll kind of go back and forth a bit. But before I dive in, I brought a show and tell. For my show and tell today, I brought my rabbi and friend, Rabbi Corey Helfand, that I would love to turn to give us a little bit of context with high holidays coming up, what we can be thinking about as we think about this topic in the context of everything, in the context of the new year and what we're about to embark on, the high holiday journey. Rabbi Helfand has been an enormous leader in this area. He not only has been full of incredible insights and wisdom, but he's also really put facts on the ground and pounded the pavement and gone to meetings and met with school boards, mobilized our own community, his own congregation. He's truly been an inspiration, has been a role model of how to make things happen with respect to this effort. So Rabbi Corey, I'd like to turn it over to you to say a few words to us. Just going to give him a minute to unmute. Rabbi Corey, you with us? I know you're on there. Okay, well, maybe I'll get started. Wait, one moment. Okay,
Rabbi,
why don't I get started? I know he's somewhere in there. He might be having Corey Helfand. I know he's on the participant list that's logged in right now.
he's unmuted.
He is unmuted.
And your slides disappeared, so
okay.
just, yeah.
Okay, well, maybe he's having technical issues, so we can come back to him. All right, so let's talk about what is ethnic studies. And I wish I could tell you, except that as some of you probably know by now, people don't really agree. It's any number of things, and it remains a largely undefined field. What we do know is a couple of things about it. There are different types of ethnic studies, and you can generally place them into two buckets. There's what I think of as regular ethnic studies, and that tends to focus more on cultural diversity. It talks about challenges and contributions of different communities and ethnic groups. Its focus is specifically California and Californian ethnic groups, and it emphasizes critical thinking, where, as we hope with education in general, the students are presented with facts and presented with analysis, and they're expected to go through it and form their own opinions. This is quite different from a field called critical ethnic studies, which is more of an activist field, and it comes from a very particular political standpoint.
Alina?
Its emphasis is, yeah?
Can you hear me?
Is that Rabbi Corey?
It is?
Yeah. Hi, Rabbi Corey. I'm just going to finish. Yep. Hi. Welcome.
No problem.
I'm just going to finish this one slide, and then we'll switch over to you. So the emphasis for critical ethnic studies, besides really focusing on four basic groups of color, and those are African Americans, Asians, Latinx, and Native Americans. The focus is really on this paradigm of victims and oppressors. It does not focus on just California or the US. It brings in international movements. In particular, it is closely tied to the BDS movement and has a strong element of demonizing Israel as part of its movement. And most importantly, this all comes from the fact that it promotes a particular one-sided political agenda and a particular approach. And we'll talk about what that approach is. But now that I see that Rabbi Corey is back with us, I'll turn it over to him to say a few words, and then we'll pick up from there.
Thanks, Alina. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Alina? Okay, great. Sorry about that, everyone. I had to wait for the Zoom gods to unmute, and then there was technical difficulties, so I'll go ahead and get those out of the way now before Rosh Hashanah. First of all, thank you for having me, and my gratitude to you, Alina, for the leadership that you have played over this. And it's nice to be on the road again with you, having done this with you, I guess, a month or so ago with Limud. Friends, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for being here and the importance of this particular moment. Part of what we are faced with at this time in Jewish tradition is the act of tshuva, of repentance. But at the core of the word tshuva is the word shuv, to return. And when I think about what it means to return to something with regard to ethnic studies, this is a curriculum that we will return to over and over and over again, in theory, for the foreseeable future, for us and for our children. And I think it's really important to be clear that it's not about opposing ethnic studies. Rather, it's about making sure that the ethnic studies curriculum that is going to be put into our schools, that will lift up the value in Jewish tradition of V'shinantam levanecha, of teaching our children, that it is a curriculum that is created with integrity and that promotes a process whereby we encourage our students to become critical thinkers and people who can really wrestle with all of the complexities of what it means to be a human being in this world. And that's critical. That is really important, rather than become a curriculum that indoctrinates a certain point of view or a certain bias. And that's really what's at stake here. Tshuva, that sense of return, is the idea that we're going to come back to this over and over and over and over again. And if you really want to create long-term change, it starts with what is at the foundation, what is at the core, what is at the base of what it is that we're about to implement. And that's why we're wrestling with this so thoughtfully. Up until now, it's been a real push and a real slog, and we've won some things and there's others that we've lost. And part of the reason we're gathering people here today is, again, to do that sense of tshuva, to come back to it and make sure that the foundations are strong and that the foundations not only support all voices that need to be heard, but in particular, the Jewish voice, making sure that it's not put before our students in a biased way, in a way that's going to force them to think a particular way, rather than giving them the opportunity to be critical thinkers. And also to make sure that what's at the foundation right now is that which we can build upon going forward. If we don't make sure that we get it right now, in terms of how we teach about Israel, in terms of how we teach about anti-Semitism, in terms of how we talk about the Jewish narrative from all over the world throughout our history, if we don't do that work right now, then the narrative that we will come back to over and over and over again will not only be without our own story, but it will be laden with particular biases and hatred and bigotry that we fight on a day-to-day basis. Again, it's really important to know this is not about being opposed to teaching ethnic studies, but it's about doing so in a way that's thoughtful and intentional, so that every time we come back to it, we feel like, to the best of our abilities, our teachers, many of whom are going to be tasked with the responsibility of teaching our narrative on our behalf, that they do so in a balanced and thoughtful way. And they do so free of hate and free of bias, and in a way that will lift up all of the stories that are a part of our collective Jewish identity. And so that is our tshuva, that is our responsibility to come back to right now, as we have been over the last couple of years, that we're going to hear about tonight, and why it's so critically important that we set our children up for success, and that we set them up in a way where they will delve into the critical questions and thinking that we want our students to have, rather than being told that it is this way or that way. And so that's why we're here. That's our tshuva, to make sure that the foundation is strong. And by committing to this work in an ongoing way, by all of you being here, with Alina, with Michael, with all of the people who are here, this allows us to continue to make sure that the path going forward is one that we all feel strong about and that we all feel confident in, so that we can make sure that our students are taught a balanced path forward. And so I thank you for your commitment to learning, for thinking critically, and for understanding what's at stake in this real sacred work of tshuva. May we all be blessed with strength as we make this fight part of one that we will not only benefit for now, but that our children will benefit for generations to come.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Corey, and amen. Okay, so we'll take off from talking about the different buckets of ethnic studies, the regular and the critical ethnic studies. And I just wanted to say a few words. So as Rabbi Corey was saying, it's important to understand that we're not talking about being against the subject of ethnic studies, because if you look at what's called the legislative intent, what did the legislators mean to do? What did they intend when they came out with the law? And Mike will talk a little bit more about the process, but just to give you an idea, the law is supposed to empower all students to learn about each other and what they share in common, to learn about history and contributions, and advance respect for and better understanding of Californians' deep and diverse cultural history, which sounds like, they all sound like admirable goals. And from that, we then have the ethnic studies model curriculum, which aims to critique empire and its relationship to white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, cisheteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, anthropomorphism, and other forms of power and oppression at the intersections of our society. What? So we look at this. Empower students to learn about each other and what they share in common. And then we look at this, and we look at connecting ourselves to past and contemporary resistance movements, to challenging imperialist, colonial, hegemonic beliefs, and so on. And something somewhere must have broken down. So before we talk specifically about where the breakdown was, let's look at what is the specific political ideology that has to do with the critical ethnic studies field. So the particular ideology is a neo-Marxist Third World Liberation Front dogma. It is similar to Black Panthers movement in that it supports anti-capitalism. It has a pro-militant aspect. It tends to support communist governments like China, Cuba, North Korea, and generally opposes the self-determination for Jews in Israel. Also tends to berate nonviolent US civil rights leaders as docile, and we'll come back to that. This is the same stuff that you see in the ethnic studies model curriculum, which I'll sometimes abbreviate as the ESMC. And the issue is not that it shouldn't be taught by any means, because there are important things that have come out of this movement, despite the many negative aspects of it. The issue is that, as you see from the from the history social science framework, the curriculum needs to provide, any curriculum that has to do with social science needs to provide a balance of topics and present multiple, sometimes even opposing points of view. So the issue, as you can understand, is not that it's teaching about these things, but rather that it is promoting that point of view as the point of view of ethnic studies. So there was much feedback that came out when the draft first came out. This was last year when it originally came out, and it was described by the left and the right across the board. It was condemned for many things, but for example, one of the most telling editorials from the editorial board of the LA Times talks about this being focused, the curriculum being focused on one side only, and kind of force-feeding students pre-digested political views. And interestingly enough, this is a comment from an Asian community leader that I think actually has given us permission to use his name, so I'll need to add that in here. it's interesting to hear from leaders in specific communities that are actually represented in the curriculum who say that, look, by no means is this representing all of us, because this heavily politicized curriculum is not what all of us are looking for. Where are the contributions? Where are the prominent, in this case, Asian authors, business executives, and so on, that the focus on the politically militant figures, as well as anybody with this particular political ideology, takes away from the intent of what was supposed to be this ethnic studies curriculum. You might think that things got better since last year, but unfortunately, this is some of the feedback that we're getting now for the second draft. And this one, the first quote is from a Wall Street Journal editorial board itself, talking about similar things. So we haven't gotten far away from this force feeding. And Cal Matters also reports, which is a California publication, reports on also ideological indoctrination. So a lot of focus on this indoctrination piece. And it's helpful to look at some particular examples. So how does this actually play out? In theory, okay, there's this funky indoctrination into particular political ideology, but how does it play out? So one of the ways that we see that is when you look at the role models, the figures that if you look on draft 1, so between draft 1 and draft 2, as you'll hear about, the principles are staying the same. The framework, the overall approach stays the same. And you can see the role models, figures of significance as they're called, in draft 1 that are mentioned that fall out of these principles. And those are that consistently there's a choice of Marxist militant figures. And whenever there's a choice between different ones, the choice is always to go with one of the militant figures. And so we see that play out, whether it's in the Latinx section, where we have Oscar Lopez Rivera, who led the Marxist-Leninist organization responsible for over 100 bombings in American cities, including New York and Chicago, or Lolita Lebron, who led an armed assault on the US House of Representatives, or for that matter, the fact that John Lewis and MLK are considered passive and docile. And those are actually quotes from the second draft of the curriculum. So these are from an article that is footnoted in the second draft of the curriculum. So you can see who's omitted and who's in and what the choices tend to be. And as you can expect, there's some pushback, including from educators who say, how can you tell our story without these seminal figures? So the question is, what in the world does Israel and BDS have to do with all this? Because we can be concerned as citizens in general, as Californians, as Americans, about a curriculum like this, but specifically as Jews, what is the concern? Well, it turns out that, and for those of you who are not familiar with the term, BDS stands for the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement Against Israel. As it turns out, critical ethnic studies is very tightly intertwined with the BDS movement and specifically anti-Israel and anti-Zionist advocacy. We know that because you can look at, for example, all 13 members of the founding board of the Critical Ethnic Studies Association. We know that they are all active BDS proponents. We know that this association passes resolutions on the academic boycott. We know that at their conferences, they teach sessions on BDS, and this is not a secret, so they are very open about it, and we'll talk about the fact that BDS is an integral part of this ethnic studies movement. And we heard that actually in public comments during one of the meetings that the state had, where a lot of the people coming forward talked about the fact that BDS and Palestinian rights and Israeli colonialism are in fact integral to the teaching of ethnic studies. And so don't forget that they're referring to this form of ethnic studies with these particular guidelines. The tie-in, the connection between critical ethnic studies and anti-Zionism is that it so happens that this Third World Liberation Front, this neo-Marxist Third World political ideology, historically has included anti-Israel advocacy. And if you look up, if you read some historical background on this, you'll see that this is part of its foundation, and it continues to be an integral part. So, for instance, we have in the second draft, and I'm flipping back and forth, by the way, between the first and second draft, because some of the specifics were removed from the second draft and it was kept more general, but the lessons and the concepts and the principles, the values were left the same. And so in order to see how do they play out, you can look to the first draft. Some of these, however, are from the second draft as well, such as a book called Education at War, which is a text that is referred to and talks about grappling with ways to connect anti-Zionism in the context of Middle East politics to anti-racist and anti-imperialist movements in the US. Some of you probably recall that in the first draft, we saw the creation of Israel as described as the Nakba, and BDS was described as a global social movement that currently aims to establish freedom for Palestinians living under apartheid conditions. By the way, the only non-US movement described in the ESMC. So, how did this happen? Mike, could you tell us a little about how did we get to this point?
Sure. This is a very convoluted story, but it should become clearer as we go through this a little bit. A lot of it involves politics, and the old story of how if you don't want to see how the sausage is made. There's a lot of sausage making went into this. But a couple of things. I think it's really important to remember that the people who are behind this ethnic studies model curriculum, they are very serious about this. To them, all these buzzwords and jargon that Elena described, they are very, very serious about all this. And how this plays out in practice is what we are seeing right now, literally coming up this month at San Francisco State University, when Rabab Abdelhadi, who is a professor in their Middle Eastern Studies department, has invited convicted terrorist Leila Khaled to come, of course, over Zoom, and speak to students there. This is a convicted airplane hijacker who tried to kill dozens and dozens of people. So, this is directly in line with this critical ethnic studies movement that itself was birthed at San Francisco State University. So the bill was passed in 2016, just coincidentally, it was Assembly Bill 2016, and it was sponsored by then Assembly Member Luis Alejo, who, you saw quotes from him that Alina put up earlier on the slides. And the bill was to mandate teaching of ethnic studies as a graduation requirement in California high schools. There was no mention of the specific type of ethnic studies. Could it be what Alina described as regular, what other people described as multicultural ethnic studies? And certainly you look at the language he used, it would seem more appropriate for that than this other critical ethnic studies pathway. And I think one quote also that's very appropriate to bring into this, in addition to the jargon that Elena used, one of the descriptions from the Critical Ethnic Studies Association itself, their academic organization, says, informed by ethnic studies, we bring into conversation the ways that concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to US imperialism ground our approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus. And again, they are very serious about this. So the Assembly Bill required the creation of an ethnic studies model curriculum. That's actually separate. I misspoke before. It was not to make it mandatory. That's a separate bill. See, it does get confused in the sausage making. So this was simply to require the Department of Education to create a model curriculum. And originally, the deadline was at the end of 2019 that the Instructional Quality Commission, an arm of the California Department of Education, would have been required to develop and adopt this. And then by March of 2020 was a deadline in the bill for the State Board of Education to adopt it. There was no option in there for them not to adopt one. They had to adopt it by March of 2020. Well, what happened was, over the course of last summer, I was made aware of this by somebody else and looked at this and said, whoa, this is a big issue. Started talking to a couple of local Israel advocacy, local in California, Jewish community organizations. Brought them into this. They were really pretty much unaware of it or minimally aware of it. And people started looking into this process of what was going on, because what had happened was that the State Department of Education hired people solely from the critical ethnic studies background to prepare this model curriculum. So it was released last year. And it was not only full of this critical ethnic studies jargon, but also promoted BDS and anti-Zionism, completely omitted anti-Semitism. As Alina mentioned, the glossary in there was something that described BDS as this global social justice movement. So when this actually became public, there was an uproar from all of the Jewish community organizations that were looking at it, and most critically from the Legislative Jewish Caucus in the California State Legislature. So given that, the draft was condemned in very strong terms by State Superintendent of Public Instruction Tony Thurmond, by the President of the California Board of Education, Linda Darling-Hammond, and by Governor Newsom, who said that the draft would, and I quote, never see the light of day. So it was sent back for further work. And then, of course, as this process was going on, they were up against a legislative deadline that had to be fixed, because otherwise they're going to be in breach of law if they didn't have one that was going to be adopted by the IQC by the end of December. So a bill was quickly put together in the waning days of the legislative session to allow a one-year extension on this process. Simultaneously, the other bill, which I was confusing 2016 with, which is AB 331, that is the bill to make the teaching of ethnic studies a mandatory high school graduation requirement in California. That bill was authored by Assemblymember Jose Medina, who is a member of not only the Hispanic Legislative Caucus, but also the Jewish Legislative Caucus, because his first wife was Jewish and his children were raised Jewish. So Assemblymember Medina, despite being not Jewish himself, is a member of the Jewish Legislative Caucus. And the caucus unanimously condemned the first draft, and Assemblymember Medina pulled his AB 331 from the last legislative session and decided to make it a two-year bill. And this is a bill that was very near and dear to his heart, but he realized with this draft on the table, he couldn't proceed with that. So it went back for reworking, and there were supposed to have been hearings earlier in the spring, and then this little thing called the coronavirus pandemic happened, and everybody had to suddenly shift and pivot and do things in different ways. So it took a little bit longer than they anticipated, but the second draft came out. And the problem with the second draft was that they had many of the same people who worked on the first draft, which they already basically discarded. They discarded it to the point of pulling it off the California Department of Education website. You can no longer go onto the CDE website and even find that first draft. But many of the same people that were involved in working on it continued working with the California Department of Education behind the scenes. There was a remarkable lack of transparency in how the CDE conducted this process. So the new draft came out, and there were a few good things in there. They took out the glossary that defined BDS as a global social justice movement. They put some reference to the American Jewish experience and anti-Semitism. And there was some guidance added that encouraged teachers to expose students to multiple and often competing sources of information and to foster respect for diverse viewpoints. And language added urging local school districts to be transparent, ironically, though the CDE wasn't, and to actively seek public input when implementing it locally. But there were still very, very significant problems. Not only what Alina mentioned about the guiding principles, but the references to American Jews completely ignored the experiences of Mizrahi Jews, Jews of color, Jews from the former Soviet Union, whose stories are less acknowledged. The only unit that they referred to in their appendix of courses that are being taught elsewhere in the state as models for them, for people locally to look at. The only unit that placed a significant focus on Jews compared Jews to Irish Americans, and the task of the students was to describe how Jews and Irish Americans both gained racial privilege, flattening the Jewish experience, ignoring the diversity of the American Jewish community, and of course, ignoring, white supremacist hostility and violence against Jews of all backgrounds. But overall, it was certainly an improvement. Nobody could deny that. So the initial reaction of Jewish community organizations was, okay, this is positive. You're making steps in the right direction. Let's, here are some suggestions of ways to do it a little bit further. And then came about a month ago, middle of August, the IQC was going to hold, and did hold, public hearings starting August 13th, where people could then publicly testify by Zoom in terms of what they thought about this. The night before, they sent out an email announcing that not only were they going to include a unit on Arab American studies within Asian American studies, while continuing to exclude Jews, Armenians, Persians, Copts, Kurds, other Middle Eastern communities, which actually comprise the majority of Californians from the Middle East and North Africa. But they were also going to delay publishing this unit on Arab Americans until after the time for public comment had passed. So that section would not be available for public comment. It would come into the third draft, but they explained that the third draft would only be for refining only, not for changing things. Now, there are multiple statements on the record from critical ethnic studies proponents, not only supporting BDS, but statements that say that any unit on Arab Americans must center the Palestinian cause. And this raises very justifiable concerns that anti-Zionism, including BDS, will find its way back into the curriculum without the opportunity for public scrutiny. So numerous organizations not only stand with us, but MENA, the Jews Indigenous to Middle East and North Africa, AJC, American Jewish Committee, ADL, immediately came out with statements opposing this. And what we had heard, and this is not verified, I cannot quote anybody on this, but we had heard that a Department of Education, their Director of Curriculum Frameworks, a woman named Shanine Coates, personally advised the Legislative Jewish Caucus that it was best to hold off on any critiques until the public comment period over the 10 days preceding it. And it was right during that time, when the Jewish community was encouraged to lay low, that the most intensive advocacy efforts for the Arab section took place. So now we not only have a curriculum that still has problems, but the main criticism that the Legislative Jewish Caucus had over the first draft was that it completely omitted the American Jewish experience. And now what we are told is, not only are you going to continue to be omitted, but we're going to put in a essentially non-vetted unit on Arab Americans. And that was the unit that had problems in the first draft all the way along. So now with this on the second draft, again, numerous organizations, and then JCRC joined in as well, and just developed a campaign, a social media campaign called Jews Not Included. We basically cannot support what they are doing. So now the current time period in September is open for public comment, and we're going to be talking about what you can do with all that as well. But we remain, very, very concerned now, seeing that not only have none of the promises that have been given to us last year, except for like the removal of the really overt anti-Semitism, and that was very, very low-hanging fruit. We are hearing that the glossary that was taken out that defined BDS as the global social justice movement may be put back in. Again, that was an absolute demand of the Legislative Jewish Caucus and all the other groups, that BDS be taken out. And we know that the Arab advocacy groups are working with the people in the Department of Education. They are saying as much. AROC, which is the Arab Resource Organizing Committee, which is based in San Francisco, extremely radical pro-BDS organization. They have issued tweets thanking Superintendent Thurman for meeting with them privately, and they're announcing on social media, that they won. They're being echoed, of course, by Linda Sarsour. They're reporting that they have a seat at the table as this curriculum is being redone. And their demand is that the ethnic studies model curriculum commit to an Arab American studies that maintains the Palestinian struggle for justice within its central framework. Now, with all of this, and the curriculum not even being finalized, AB 331 got passed. It passed Senate appropriations, but funding was taken out, and then it passed the Senate, and then it passed the Assembly. The Legislative Jewish Caucus did add some amendments, which they are calling guardrails. And again, my opinion, speaking as an individual, they're pretty low-hanging fruit. What they do is they prevent teaching that is discriminatory against any particular religion, race, ethnic group, nationality, anything that's disparaging to them. It's pretty much standard non-discriminatory language that essentially is already in the California Education Code. Now, AB 331 is passed. It is on Governor Newsom's desk. It will not make it a requirement for the state until 2029, and even then, only if funding is provided for it. So it is now currently an unfunded bill. And what Rabbi Corey said about having to visit this over and over again, unfortunately, I think we will be visiting it quite often over the next 10 years. And one of the main problems from the viewpoint of many of our community organizations is that the text of the amendment that included the Legislative Jewish Caucus guardrails, the non-discriminatory language that was put in, there's a clause there that says that those amendments only become active if the state funds it. So what's the problem with that? The problem is that local school districts are free to go ahead and adopt this curriculum, paying for it on their own without any state funding. There will not be, until for 10 years, a state mandate to have this taught, but now we will have this curriculum that's going to get the approval of the State Department of Education that any local school district can take off the shelf and say, well, State Department of Education approved it, let's go ahead and teach it. And this is unfortunately probably going to get signed by the governor before this curriculum is even finalized, so we don't even know for sure what's going to be in it. And lest you think this is just a California problem, it is very, very clear to the proponents of this issue, as well as the California Department of Education, that they see this work as having national reach. Linda Darling-Hammond, again, State Board of Education president, said our efforts will have ripple effects across the country. Tony Thurmond has said, I am proud to submit these recommendations for a draft ethnic studies model curriculum that will not only serve as a roadmap for educators, but hopefully inspire action across the nation. So, as in many things, California comes first, but it's not necessarily going to be the last at all. It can absolutely be a model for the rest of the country. So what are we asking people to do? Elena, you should skip ahead a few slides here.
Yep. See that. So actually, Mike, before we get to that, there were just a couple of things that I wanted to add as well. Let me just get to the, let's see, we talked about this. One of the things I'd mentioned a couple of times, the guiding principles, which drives much of the curriculum, and that's where the political agenda gets into the curriculum. So those are in 4 out of the 7 of the guiding principles, and they remain to be the same in this draft as before. And I just wanted you to take a look at what an example is, what we mean by that. How do we know that the principles make a difference? So here's an example. The first one is an example of the current principle that's in there. And it looks kind of innocuous until you look and compare the two. So if you look at connecting ourselves to past and contemporary resistance movements, the struggle for social justice on the global and local levels to ensure truer democracy. Now, first of all, truer democracy is a dog whistle for Marxists that refers to communism and the abolition of private property. you should see the looks on some of our Soviet emigres' faces when they see this as a guiding principle. It's really quite something. Their jaws just drop when they see that. But also look at the difference between the more positive ethnic studies principle that other schools have. This is in the what I called regular ethnic studies that lots of schools around the California districts have. And this one, so in particular LAUSD, the LA district, which is the largest district in the state, a parallel principle for them is teaching students about social justice as opposed to resistance movements, social responsibility as opposed to struggle, and talking about becoming agents of change. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of it's nuanced, but you can see there's a big fight right now going over around the fact that the critical ethnic studies folks want to keep the current ethnic guiding principle. They are not interchangeable, and they are really digging in that they want these types of principles. That is why, as Mike is about to dive into what we're doing about it, you'll see that there are two sets of concerns. One of them, so we'll start with the bottom one, which is the content, has to do with things like the lack of an anti-Semitism lesson or even a definition. Groups that are excluded, as Mike mentioned, such as Jews from Middle East and North Africa, and the fact that there's an open door to BDS and anti-Zionism, which we've already seen and is integral to these guiding principles with the advocacy effort going on that Mike just mentioned. So this all has to do with content. And then on the other hand, we have things that have to do with the approach, with the overall guiding principles, and the fact that we need safeguards. We want different guiding principles, and we want safeguards against any kind of anti-Zionism, and ensuring that these lessons that are tied to the principles are not tied to the flawed principles, but rather that we have the more positive ones that we've seen in other schools. So you may have seen some information on Save California Ethnic Studies or Save Ethnic Studies that is focused on the efforts to keep the first draft as was, or as close to it as possible, including not only the guiding principles, but the actual content. It goes under, they frame it as saving ethnic studies, but of course it's not about saving ethnic studies itself, it's about saving this type of curriculum. So
actually,
back
Elena,
to Mike.
Let me just add also in terms of the Save Ethnic Studies people. So a couple of things interesting to note on this. One of which is that over the past 6 months, they campaigned across many school boards in the state to basically say, hey, our ethnic studies program is under attack by pretty much the groups they would mention would be right-wing Jews and white supremacists, okay? That was, all of us are apparently right-wing Jews. And that they wanted the school boards to endorse not teaching ethnic studies, but specifically the first draft that the state had already withdrawn, that members of that local school board could not even go to the State Department of Education website and read for themselves. But basically they got a bunch of school boards, members of which didn't even read that document, to say, oh no, we absolutely endorse the first draft. And they did that politically as a way of being able to go back to the Department of Education and, hold their pelts up and go, see, all these, school districts endorsed us, when again, most of them had absolutely no idea of the original content. And this is kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. We'd find out 2 days ahead of time that X school district is going to discuss this, because they could pick their targets. And they had elementary school district school boards, endorsing this when this was meant, of course, as a high school program. The other thing to point out about these folks is there's a very significant amount of self-dealing going on, because the people who wrote the draft are also some of the people who wrote the textbooks in the field that they recommended in the first draft. And they are also the ones who do the training programs for high school teachers. And there's only one program in the country that actually trains educators in ethnic studies. And guess what school it's located at? And if you said San Francisco State, you win. So there is a great deal of self-dealing that goes on within this ethnic studies community, and not even it's not even clear that this is legal for them to be promoting their own textbooks as the resources in the curriculum that they were writing. There's a significant conflict of interest there. So the action alerts. As I mentioned, JCRC's main focus is Jews need to be included. MENA is very interesting because, again, being the organization of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, they have a very specific point that cannot be erased, overlooked. People go, oh, well, Jewish studies is taught, we teach about the Holocaust. Excuse me, these are families that never lived in Europe or didn't live in Europe since the expulsion from Spain in 1492. They lived in North Africa. They lived in the Arabized lands of the Middle East. This is not their history. Where do they see themselves? So MENA was promoting something very inclusive. Yes, teach about all the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa. And as I mentioned, in California, if you look at Californians of recent Middle East and North African descent, 60% of them are not Arab. There are more Persian Jews in the Los Angeles area alone than there are Palestinians in the entire state of California. And yet again, the Jews were completely excluded. So Stand With Us and American Jewish Committee have explicitly endorsed MENA's approach. MENA submitted a curriculum to the state and said, here's a curriculum you can teach. Now, the previous group was rubber stamping curriculum that the critical ethnic studies proponents, oh, we have a curriculum in Asian Pacific Islanders, great. You guys like this? Yeah, sure, we wrote it. Good, okay, it's in. I mean, that was the full extent of the conversation. People have listened to the actual recordings of the meetings, and it was pretty much done with no debate. Now, MENA has submitted this curriculum. I'm not sure that they're willing to consider it at all. So it's really important that people take action on this, take action through any and all of these organizations. Each group has petitions that it has on its websites, okay? You can look up AJC, you can look up Stand With Us, you can look up MENA, you can look up JCRC. And also you can simply write your own email. The ones that are there are nice because they sort of package it for you and automatically forward it. If you're going to write your own, it's very, very critical. Elena, can you put the next slide up there? Sorry, a little bit further down. I think there we go. Sorry about that. Really, really important. If you want to submit comments, you don't send it to Governor Newsom. I mean, you can copy him on it, but you have to send it to that ethnicstudies@cde.ca.gov, okay? Every single one of those comments goes into the public record and is searchable, and they will publish all of them on their website, okay? And you need to be specific. You have to say exactly what the problem's, not, we reject the curriculum. You need to give substantive concerns, okay? And that can take a while. So if you don't want to do that, fine. Go to one of the other organizations or multiple ones of them and go ahead and sign on to their petitions. And they have pre-written ways to do this. Actually, let me show you. I will just share my screen for a quick moment. And then I'll give it back to Elena here. But this is what the Stand With Us one looks like, okay? So, and you can just look up Stand With Us at California Ethnic Studies. And again, you fill out the form and, very, clear do's and don'ts. You fill it out here. You can just sign on their message. You can add yours if you want. You click submit and you're done. So it's just extremely important that people do this because the governor has no control over what the IQC is going to do. The governor has control only over whether he is going to sign AB 331 or not. Everything else now is happening at the Department of Education level. Okay, Elena, back to you.
Okay, let me see if there are a couple of things that I just wanted to throw in. Mike had mentioned some of the petitions and the letters going around. As he said, please do sign all of them. This is a numbers game, so and every approach is important. A couple of times I've referred to the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, ACES. I think Barb referred to it at the beginning. We've formed a grassroots group that's really focused on the overall approach. So some of you have already gotten the action alert. If not, then that'll be coming as well, in addition to the ones that Mike mentioned. The focus for most of these organizations, when we talk about the guiding principles, has to do with the revising the principles and adding elements of balance. And there are examples like the LAUSD one that I mentioned that talk about the importance of bringing in different perspectives and not promoting, in the second red bullet, you'll see that it actually talks about rather than promoting specific political activism. It's not foolproof, it doesn't work perfectly, and it's not like they don't have any problems with any sort of indoctrination in their classrooms, but it's certainly a help, and it is a safeguard that makes a difference. Mike talked about the MENA and MENA Jews and MENA. We'll maybe come back to this in Q&A if people have questions around it. What's next? So Mike talked about what this period that we're in right now, which is the public comment period. Unfortunately, the Arab American unit, which included BDS and anti-Zionism in draft 1, and the claim from the community is that it is absolutely essential to include BDS and anti-Zionism in their Arab American unit. Unfortunately, that unit will not be available for comment until November 18th, or a little bit before, when they post the agenda, and that's a date of the Instructional Quality Commission. That's the commission, the committee that votes on the draft itself. At the end of November, we'll enter another 45-day public comment period. That will be for minor changes only. So it's especially important. What we do now really makes the biggest difference. We don't know exactly what will happen during that next 45-day public comment period, but the way it's been expressed to us by the CD itself, by the California Department of Education, is that that really will be more for tweaking. And then January or March is when the State Board of Education will take a vote. So why is this big? You heard Mike talk about the fact that there are national plans for this, as often happens with curricula. California leads the way, and there are many states that have already explicitly announced plans to implement ethnic studies once California is done with theirs. The National Education Association has made that explicit statement as well. K through 8 is also beginning to implement. So we're not just talking about high school students now, we're talking about K through 8 as well. And this is truly far ranging, the effects of this, that without substantial changes, we would be opening ourselves to anti-Semitism in the classroom across the board. So when you think about why is this big, it's not just big for your kids, it's not just big for California's kids. This is really, we're talking about decades and decades that we will return to again and again, as Rabbi Corey said. Okay, there are a couple of alerts here. There are a number of them going around, as we mentioned. 2 of them are here, and I think somebody, perhaps Barb, maybe will put these in a chat so that you can just copy and paste. There is the Stand With Us one that Mike highlighted. There's the ACES one, the grassroots one that I mentioned. And you probably have seen others from JCRC, from AJC, from MENA, and so on. Please do forward them to everyone you know, Jewish or non-Jewish. Is for the ACES one. This is the one that focuses, that focuses on the guidelines. There's really nothing there about the specific to Jews. So for that one, you can forward to anyone. The others forward to all mostly Jewish friends and family. You can do it across the country. This is now becoming a national effort. If you can write letters to the editor, if you have that capability, please do that. We need to make our voices heard as much as possible. Very importantly, and Mike, do you want to talk about this for a moment, about the importance of talking to your local school boards and how to do that?
Sure. So as you know, I mentioned, even if Governor Newsom doesn't sign AB 331 and the state mandate is not in effect, there are moves, like in Marin County, for example, where I live, we have 3 major local high school districts. All of them are making moves towards an ethnic studies curriculum. And it is time for all of us in our local districts to be getting active on this, because I will guarantee you the other side is going to be doing the same thing. School boards are responsive to the local community, but they're only responsive if we speak up. So this is the time to look at your local high school districts. I mean, yes, even K through 8 is going to become important, but primarily starting right now in the high school districts, because the curriculum that the state is going to approve is specifically written for high schools. And start contacting your local school board members. And, you know, the best way to do this is, rather, I think, than, you know, 30 individuals all sending emails of concern to the school board, get a group of 30 people together, send one email, ask for a meeting. Some school boards are at large representation, which means all the board members represent everybody in the district. Many or most of them are actually done by a district. So, you know, if you have people living within the certain high school district, you may be able to cover several different board members with 5 or 10 people each. And you go ahead and you ask for a Zoom meeting and you want to explain your concerns about it. You want to find out where the school district is in terms of an ethnic studies curriculum. And you want to educate them about the problems that our community has with the draft that's going on at the state. Because even though these people are fully involved in schooling, they may not have been following this issue very closely. I would actually bet that most of them have not been following this closely at all, and they are certainly not aware of all of the points of concern that our community has with this. So this is one of those, you know, Rav Hillel moments. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if we don't stand up for our community and we don't start getting active, and this goes for, you know, members of our community up and down the entire state of California. If we don't do this, nobody's going to be doing it for us, and we're going to find a critical ethnic studies, anti-Israel curriculum being brought into our high schools, regardless of whether AB 331 makes it mandatory or not.
Great. Thank you for that awesome summary. One thing that I'll also mention is that if you do have questions and you'd like help getting ready for something like this, or need some talking points or even a script, please email what you see right here, calstudies@gmail.com, and that'll also go into your chat along with the URLs. And we'll be happy to help you with that. The emphasis is basically that you want to be careful to place is on the type of ethnic studies. It's not about ethnic studies, it's that you want the regular ethnic studies, like the LAUSD model, you can even name it, to show that there is something else out there, not the current ethnic studies model curriculum. Okay, so with that, I think what we'll do now is we'll open up chat for questions for people to, we'll take some questions that people are typing in, and we did get a few questions ahead of time. People emailed them, so we're gonna jump to those for a moment.
So here we go. I've got a list of questions that were pre-submitted, which I'm happy to serve up for you. And Mike and Alina, you can toss a coin or arm wrestle, or however you want to handle it. It's up to you.
Well, I think,
so
sorry, Barb.
First and foremost, go ahead.
1 second, I just want to make sure. The guardrails one, Mike, we've talked about. There was one that I wanted Mike to cover. So, and I think we got that one. So yeah, I think we could dive right in, and between Mike and me, we'll just jump in, whichever one feels like it. Go for it.
So the first one is, we heard this ethnic studies is for high school and also that it's for K through 12. Could you please clarify?
Sure. I mean, the specific ethnic studies model curriculum that is being developed at the state level right now in the CDE process is for high schools. The proponents of critical ethnic studies want this to be absolutely in every grade K through 12. That is their goal. So that's the difference right now.
Okay. The The next question is, are Jews the only ones, well, you sort of addressed this, but in case there's more, are Jews the only ones who are opposed to this curriculum? If it's as awful as you say, shouldn't lots of people be upset? Who else has concerns?
Oh, good.
So
I can. Oh, you want to go ahead, Elena? Go ahead.
All right, I'll start and then Mike
You start.
Can loop in. So one of the things that's been really revelatory for me is talking to people from the various ethnic groups that are covered in the curriculum. This curriculum is really, really long. So we're talking about, the first draft was over 600 pages. The second one, I believe, is close to 400 pages. And most people don't actually bother looking at it. When you actually go to people from various groups that are covered in the curriculum and you put some sections in front of them, what you find is almost without exception, among the general population of these ethnic groups, the answer is no, this is not what I want my children learning. And you can see from what we've been talking about in terms of the focus on the militant approach, the political indoctrination, the particular ideological agenda, that there's no way the Jews would be the only ones that would have a problem with this. Sure enough, from Asian to Black to Latinx, across the board, we have people that are really concerned. You don't get to hear from those people because most people don't know about it. The activists know about it because they're out there pushing for this. The general population just does not know. And don't even get me started on emigres that came from communist countries, because some of them have looked at this. We've asked some of them to actually review it, and I had the experience of quite a number of them saying, I'm really sorry, I just can't. This is too traumatic. It's like deja vu with what I learned in school when I was growing up. So I don't know what you have to add to that, Mike, but maybe you've got a few.
Sure, a couple of things. And, one of the things is within even some of the groups that are mentioned, you have to realize that these people are very, very good at hiding what they're selling, because if they can describe BDS as a global social justice movement for the rights of Palestinians, then you can imagine, how they describe their curriculum to school board members or other folks who haven't really read and gotten into the weeds on it. But absolutely, in terms of other ethnic groups, the Hindu Americans have been completely excluded, okay? And there were, if you go back about a year, AJC in the LA office, they put together a very important coalition letter that was from them. It was from the Armenian community. It was from Korean American community. I believe the Copts were also included, and about 4 or 5 other groups, which was a very important letter of people starting to work together on this, okay? The Armenians in particular, another group with a history of genocide, being completely excluded from this ethnic studies curriculum. And one of the things I'm going to go ahead and share, because I want to show you this very interesting website that MENA has put together in coalition with other groups. So let me go ahead and get this up so you can see it. This is brand new. This is a coalition called AMI, Advocates for Inclusive Middle Eastern Education. And you can see here that what we have is MENA, 30 years after, is an American Iranian group, mostly Iranian emigres who had to flee after the Khomeiniist Islamist revolution there. The Assyrian Foundation of America, the Assyrian Association of Southern California, the Copts, the Baha'is, the Zoroastrians. So this is a site where people are now coming together for an inclusive Middle Eastern education. They're not saying don't include the Arabs. What they're saying is don't exclude us and pick and choose from the Middle East and suddenly decide that Arab Americans are a necessary part of teaching about Asian Americans, but Armenian Americans are not. And Jewish Americans are not, and Persian Americans are not. The Hindus are more out of the Middle East, but I know for a fact that the Hindu American Foundation itself has also been very, very active on this. So again, the duplicity of the critical ethnic studies proponents. A year ago, they said, no, We have to have a separate unit on Arab Americans. It cannot be part of Asian Americans. And then a year later, oh no, Arab American studies has always been an inseparable part of Asian American studies. I mean, directly out of 1984, you know, Oceania has always been at war with East Asia and always been at war with Eurasia. They pivoted on a dime like that and say, well, now we have to say, you know, the Arabs are in, but no other Asian groups that we don't like are in. So that's a very long answer to a short question to say, yes, we are working together with other groups on this.
Great. There's another question here that it says, AROC has a seat at the table. This is responding, I guess, to something that you said earlier. AROC has a seat at the table and is working with curriculum writers. Why aren't we?
The short answer to that is because the curriculum writers are all the folks who are, the first draft, they were critical ethnic studies proponents. And again, what's going on behind the scenes right now is not entirely clear. The staff member that CDE brought on to oversee this process, who does not have an education credential at all, is someone who is herself aligned with critical ethnic studies, and I believe off the top of my head aligned with BDS. And so, you know, the reason for it is that they really don't want us to have a seat at this table. They are welcoming AROC's participation. They are not welcoming the participation of the Jewish community.
Barb, there was one question about the definition that I just want to go to. Let me just go to the, so one question was, why can't we just have the definition of the State Department definition, Department of Education definition of anti-Semitism, and wouldn't we be covered in that? Because the full definition does include examples of Israel demonization and double standards as an example of anti-Semitism. So AJC has been at the forefront of, together with ADL, of arguing for this particular definition to make sure that that is in there. Stand With Us, I believe MENA all have argued for it. JCRC is still figuring out what definition they're going to submit, I believe. However, all the other organizations are really on board with this. So that is the plan. Again, as with all of these safeguards, that doesn't mean that we're home free, but each one really makes a difference when you put them together.
The next question is, does ethnic studies affect campuses? If so, what can Jewish clubs do about it?
Okay, so that's a separate but entirely related issue. That in an entirely different bill, AB 1460, I believe, that was just passed and signed into law by Governor Newsom. It now makes it a graduation requirement for Cal State University campuses that they must take a course in ethnic studies. And this was actually passed over the objections of the CSU Board of Regents. They had a much more expansive policy that would have allowed a course in ethnic studies or Jewish studies, or if I remember correctly, social justice studies, or LGBTQ studies. It gave a much broader list of courses that could be used to satisfy this requirement. The bill that was passed, that was vetoed, a very similar bill was vetoed by Governor Brown on the grounds of legislative overreach into academic oversight. Governor Newsom did sign it, and that makes starting for the entering freshman class next year, it does make it mandatory. And so they will have to take a course in ethnic studies, and pretty much at all of the university campuses, ethnic studies departments are critical ethnic studies departments.
And I will add to that, at the risk of stating the obvious, the biggest impact I believe that there is on our college campuses is the fact that our high school students and our K-8 students that will be going onto college campuses will be now learning this in school as they enter college. So you have to now think about not only the Jewish students learning this, but their peers, and the atmosphere that it will exacerbate on college campuses as they enter college.
The next question, thank you. The next question is, if ethnic studies becomes a high school requirement, what course will it replace?
So I can tell you, actually, my niece is currently in the San Mateo district, and it has already replaced, they currently have the first semester of 9th grade world history that has been replaced by ethnic studies. There are, I think, school districts will be able to decide for themselves which subjects are getting the short shrift and are getting replaced. But in general, it is a semester of ethnic studies that would be required, and it will be some sort of history or social studies course that is replaced from there, whether US or world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question is, do you think rabbis should address the subject, do you think rabbis should address this subject during the coming high holidays?
That's such a great question. Rabbi Corey, are you still with us? Because I know that that is certainly what Rabbi Corey is planning on doing, and I really hope that all the rabbis are going, or as many rabbis as know about this issue and are familiar with it, will address it during the high holidays, because I truly believe that there are very few things that will impact our community more. I can't really think of anything that will impact our community more in a very direct way in the coming year and beyond. So that is absolutely my hope, and I encourage you to suggest that to your rabbis.
There's a question here in the chat that says, have either of you been in touch with Jesse Gabriel and the Jewish Coalition who were involved in the negotiation of the so-called guardrails about what's happening in the current negotiations? Have they stopped negotiations? Have they stopped discussions, or are they still working on this? And if so, what are they trying to do?
The bill is already passed by the legislature. It is a done deal. It is on Governor Newsom's desk. There's been a lot of discussion about how things happened at the state level. The main organization through which the Jewish community operates with the legislature is called JPAC, and they're based in Sacramento. And I think that a lot of the postmortem on this within the Jewish community is going to look and say, okay, what could have worked better on this? Are there better ways to set up lines of communication? There has been very, very frequent contact between the leaders of the Jewish community organizations and the staff member in Senator Ben Allen's office, who is the staff member for the Jewish Legislative Caucus. Ben Allen, who is from Redondo Beach, he is the current chair of the Jewish Legislative Caucus. And so the way the caucus works is that the chair has a staff member who is specifically staff member, at least part of their time, for caucus issues. And so this absolutely has been the point of contact with the caucus. But again, people are gonna have to look back and say, well, you know, looking ahead at other things that may come up in the legislature, we wanna make sure that we have the most open lines of communication possible for this.
And I'll just add to that, that as you can imagine, when you have a group of Jews, as you do with in the caucus, they do not speak with one voice, far from it. There is definitely a difference of opinion on how strong of a position to take, how focused of a position to take, how general of a position to take. So it is not my impression that negotiations are done with the ESMC, as Mike mentioned, yes, on AB 331. I think the conversation is going to continue on the ESMC, and some of it they're open about, and some of it they work on behind the scenes, such as the guardrails for what they call the guardrails for 331.
Right. What was remarkable last year was not only the unanimity of the Legislative Jewish Caucus on the first draft, but the strength of the letter that they came out with. And given the range of politics and the range of opinions within any legislative caucus on that, to see that coming down as unanimous, including Medina signing onto it, really made it quite remarkable. And that's what really also makes it extremely unfortunate that if you look at what's happened a year later, you can go back and look at the Legislative Jewish Caucus letter. It's searchable online. And unfortunately, what you'll see is that the demands that they've made basically have not come about, except for, again, the removal of the really egregious anti-Semitic comments, and for the moment, the removal of BDS. But the exclusion of Jews, which was the starting point for their objection, was not accomplished.
So the next one, you answered a part of it. It's a multiple part question. It says, I heard that Linda Sarsour tweeted to people around the country to sign Save Ethnic Studies petition, putting Arabs back in the second draft and keeping the original critical framework. Mm-hmm. Can non-Californians sign petitions? Should we be having non-Californians sign our petitions? And why do non-Californians have a say at all in California educational decisions?
So I think the answer is yes, you should absolutely be forwarding to non-Californians. My recommendation is to have people identify themselves if they are from California. So it's helpful if you are from California to give your town, for example, or to say, I am a California resident. But we should absolutely be pushing this out nationally. And why do they have a say? Well, it's for that reason that we were talking about the impact of this curriculum, because people recognize that whatever happens here will soon go around the country. So I think there's a recognition. That's also why one could ask the same question about what in the world is the Wall Street Journal doing or the New York Times doing, writing stories about this California model curriculum. But I think it's because there's a wide recognition that what happens here is going to affect the rest of the country.
Okay. The next question is, oh, you're going to like this one, Alina, because it suggests that somebody actually has signed the letter from the Alliance. It says, in the letter from the Alliance that I signed and sent to Sacramento, so somebody at least signed it, that's good. It requested aligning all lessons to impartial outcomes. Can you explain what outcomes are and why that matters?
Great. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. And by the way, for those of you that have signed all the different alerts, much appreciation. I will say that within about an hour of sending the alert, maybe 2 hours, we had over 200 signatures. We now have over 400, I believe. So thank you, and let's continue. Let me share the screen with you for a moment, and I'm going to show you the outcomes. And Barb, this will probably be our last question, I think, right? Because I think
yep. Yes, it will.
To the end. Okay. So this is a good one. Here are outcomes. So recognizing that there is an issue with this political agenda, the Department of Education attempted to bring in something that they called outcomes. And that is called outcomes in education. And they listed things that sound really positive. So if you look at these, you can see, we're building community and solidarity, we're developing civic participation skills. There's really nothing you can look at here and say that it sounds like indoctrination. It's all exactly what you would expect to see in a curriculum like this. Unfortunately, in the discussion that took place in this Instructional Quality Commission, the committee that votes on what is next, what are the next steps, and gives the guidance to the Department of Education to write this thing, the pressure from them, many of whom are critical ethnic studies proponents, was to turn instead to the guiding principles and to tie the lesson plans to the guiding principles that we saw before. And just to give you an idea, this is really small, but maybe you can see some of the stuff in red. You can see the contrast. This is where we see the critiquing empire building and the challenging imperialist colonial beliefs, conceptualizing new possibilities of post-imperial life. None of which in and of themselves, by the way, are necessarily bad things. It's the fact that that is the focus of the curriculum, as we've talked about. So unfortunately, these outcomes, which are positive, are not currently on the path to be tied to the lessons. And that is one of the things that we're asking for, is that these are the things, that these become the guiding principles, and that this is what the actual lessons are tied to. Before I turn it back over to Barb to close, I just wanted to, first of all, thank Barb for being really the best partner, best colleague, best everything that I could ever hope for. And I absolutely could not, I don't think any of us could do this work that are involved in a grassroots level, could do any of our work without her. So thank you so much for everything you do, Barb. I also wanted to give a shout out to Serena Eisenberg with AJC, who has been an incredible leader in an environment where, as I mentioned, we've got, all the Jewish leadership having lots of opinions, not just in the caucus, but as you can imagine, there are so many different opinions from different organizations. AJC, under Serena's leadership, has really taken a key role in trying to reconcile different perspectives and take a strong stand, while at the same time being very tactful and diplomatic wherever possible. So thank you so much to Serena and to AJC. And I will turn it over to Barb while putting this up just to remind you what you can do.
Great. So a couple of things, just tying up a bunch of last minute chat things. Will we be posting this? Yes, we will. So this recording will be available if any of you want to share it with other people who weren't able to attend. If we have your emails, then we could send it in a summary to everybody after the fact. If we don't have your emails, then you can see up on the screen right there, the calfstudies@gmail.com. If you want a copy of the slides, or if you want a copy of the recording, please just write to calfstudies@gmail.com. I'm sure people would be happy to share that with you. So let's see. First of all, thank you so much to Mike and Alina for sharing your insights about the model curriculum. You did a really great job taking a very complicated issue and making it something that all of us can digest. So thank you both for doing such a wonderful job. I would like to also thank Beth Amjak again and the Zoom hosts for all their work tonight. Thank all of you for attending. I do want to sum up just really briefly for a moment, because it does sound like there's several things that all of us can do to make a difference here. Obviously on the screen, the now what, so definitely sign and share the Alliance letter, the Stand With Us letter. Definitely any Jewish organization from whom you get a letter, if you read what they say and you believe it, everybody's trying to make this better, and the more signatures that we lay in, the better this will all be. Most importantly, I really encourage you to just talk to friends about this. When you're on the phone with people, talk to them about it. When you're on a Zoom, mention this. People don't know. They really don't. And when you tell them what's in it, and it doesn't matter whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, talk to your Asian friends, talk to your Latinx friends, talk to your African-American friends. They will be blown away when you say, did you know that Martin Luther King is considered, or John Lewis is considered too passive to be part of the ethnic studies curriculum? I mean, it really floors people. Anyway, so please do share the letters with your friends. Contact your local school boards. And by the way, if you need help with what you want to say to a local school board, feel free to contact CalF Studies. They'll help you. And the last thing I'm going to make a pitch for, actually, is if you want to get more involved. Because at least CalF Studies, the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, that is a grassroots movement. They're looking for people, especially with experience right now in social media campaigns, in PR, anyone who has connections with journalists, legislators, IQC members, if you happen to know any of those, or leaders of any ethnic group coalitions, because there's a lot of outreach going on right now. And if you can help make some introductions and build some bridges, that would be greatly appreciated. And short of that, if you just have an hour here and there that you'd like to lend a hand, I'm sure someone will put you to good use. So again, calfstudies@gmail.com. Please let us know if you're really interested and would like to help. And if you're not on the Betham JIAC distribution list and would like to be, please do send an email to Betham, that's all one word, JIAC, J-I-A-C, @gmail.com, and just say, please add us to the list. That's it. Thank you all. We actually did the whole thing in an hour and a half. Thank you very much for attending. Thanks for sharing your time with us and for being interested enough to learn more about this important issue. Take care, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks for being here, everybody. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.